Well, right now, the world is all taking very literally the words of St. Paul to Timothy, urging that prayers, supplications, and thanksgiving be offered for everyone, especially kings and people in authority, as the world continues to pray for the repose of the soul of Queen Elizabeth. And now, all around the world, echoes of God Save the King are resounding once again. Not that we're claiming that in any literal sense of any kind of loyalty, because we're Americans after all. But we certainly, the world seems to come together in a sense not only of mourning, but of all of this seemingly sacred ritual. And the scriptures today, probably the strangest parable of all of the teachings of Jesus, certainly confusing, tells us something about how we live in the world and how we deal with the world. That can be a bit of a challenge, because it really puts to the test our sense of how we discern what we're called to do in the world. And I bring it back to simply the observation about the British monarchy, that they are both secular rulers, even though they're part of a constitutional monarchy and have no real day-to-day authority, but also in some respects, the head of the Church of England. So they really, in some way, demonstrate leading in the world and living the faith in a particular way, in a unique way. And I'm not exactly lifting that up as an example for the rest of us to follow. Would that we just had a church full of monarchs, a church full of chiefs and kings and queens, and no one to follow us. But I want to get into this parable because it's incredibly challenging. Because the parable seems to, and actually does, commend the shrewd steward for kind of conniving his way into ingratiating himself so that he's got a soft landing, essentially, after he's gotten fired. I think in some ways we could call this the parable of Thomas Barrow from Downton Abbey, who was always trying to kind of do something cunning to save himself, and it was usually based on a lie. That's not exactly what Jesus is getting at here in this parable. There is this sense of commending the guy for being, the gospel says, prudent, but it's really more like cunning and shrewd. Now we have to be careful, because in the first reading, the prophet Amos is calling out those who are cheating, who are trampling upon the needy. And if those words don't ring loud and true from what we've seen on the news this week, I don't know what does. Using immigrants as political pawns. Tragic. And thanks be to God, the bishops are calling out politicians who are doing that, who are making them political pawns, deceiving them and leading them onto an airplane and shipping them someplace where they're bound to fail. I can't believe we get away with that in the United States today. Would that happen to our immigrant ancestors? Everyone would be screaming. We should be thinking about that. So Jesus isn't really talking about commending people for being dishonest and for cheating and trampling upon the needy. But he's really getting at how it is that we engage the world. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus sends the disciples out 2 by 2 on their first mission. And he said, be cunning as serpents and peaceful as doves. Now that's really not all that clear. But he's sending them into the world and saying, the world is not going to take kindly to the message of the gospel. So you have to think, this is not just about being pacifists. This is not just about rolling over and taking it on the chin. But if we want to convert the world, if we want to preach the gospel and we want people to hear it, we have to do it boldly. And sometimes that's going to mean taking a risk. What this parable is really also about, I think, is about the discernment of how we use the gifts that we have been given for the service of the gospel. And as I said at the beginning of Mass, sometimes that requires thinking outside the box. One might say, well, I don't really have the kind of gifts to teach the faith or serve the poor. Well, there are lots of ways in which we can use our gifts and our talents, even in and around the parish. It's not all about people teaching the faith, though this weekend we celebrate Catechetical Sunday. Tomorrow morning we'll commission our new catechists and those who teach the faith in a variety of settings. So it is about those kinds of things. But we also have people in the community who are good with finances and good with administration and facilities, who serve on our management and planning committee. People who are good with strategic planning, who serve on our parish council or our school board. And it's putting seemingly gifts of the world at the service of the church. Be cunning as serpents. Use your wisdom, use your gifts, because we do have to think strategically. We have to think, in some ways, competitively, how it is that the gospel doesn't get lost in the din of noise in our world. And it's not that we have to water down the gospel or somehow just cave to the popular opinion, but we have to be bold and strong. And the Lord commends those who think prudently, who think strategically, and who act as cunning as serpents to face the realities of the world. And it's also how it is that we continue to engage the world. We don't just cower and say, well, the world has rejected the gospel, so let's all go hole up in monasteries and retreat from the world. No, the Lord is calling us to engage the world. And so we don't ignore or cut ourselves off from conversation with those who disagree with us. We don't simply give up on preaching the gospel because people say, I don't get that, I don't buy that, I don't accept that. No, he's telling us to be louder, bolder, and more courageous than ever. The world needs to hear the truth that Jesus Christ is Lord, and we don't back away from announcing that simply because it is difficult. The Lord blesses those who put their gifts at the service of the gospel. I look around here with great gratitude, with a great sense of joy and thanksgiving at the ways in which the gifts of this community, in so many varied ways, have been called forth, and how many serve creatively, using your gifts and your talents. And as more of our programming restores to its full stature, great example last weekend, the restoration of coffee and donuts, which if that's not symbolic of our full life, I don't know what is. As more of our programming does restore, more opportunities than ever to say, how can I get involved? What can I do for the Lord? Well, take the word of the Lord this weekend as a challenge to think a little bit more outside the box. What do I have to offer, and how can I put that at the service of the gospel? Amen.